Thank you for joining us for this month's Virtual Curators Tour. I'm Jenna Gilley, Associate Curator of Exhibitions at the Fort Wayne Museum of Art, and I'll be your guide today. We will be looking at the exhibition Handstitched Worlds, the Cartography of Quilts, organized by the American Folk Art Museum, New York, and toured by International Arts and Artists, Washington, D.C. There is something alchemical about a quilt. Ordinary materials are transformed into something wholly extraordinary that, piece by piece, block by block, embodies an accumulation of profound creativity and vision. Like many objects rooted in the everyday, quilts have the capacity to communicate stories about the context in which they were made and used. They represent maps of the quilters' lives, living records of cultural traditions, rites of passage, relationships, political and spiritual beliefs, landmark events, and future aspirations. In the same way, a map is a pocket-sized abstraction of the world beyond what can be seen. In a quilt, a maker's choice of fabric and design reveals insights into the topography of their world and place within it. The choice of fabric, whether purchased off the bolt or salvaged from a cast-off garment or cutting room floor, can relay memories of personal and community ties. When considering a quilt, it is crucial to go beyond acknowledging the beauty of the design and acuity of technique to read the whole object, locating the thread of history within the context. Quilts allow us to reclaim history for everyday individuals, particularly women, and notably women of color, at a time when the historical record is mostly silent. Pieced together, quilts allow us to reconstruct a profoundly personal outlook on the world, balancing creativity and tradition, individuality, and collective zeitgeist. Handstitched Worlds, the Cartography of Quilts, is an invitation to read quilts as maps, tracing the paths of individual stories and experiences that illuminate larger historical events and cultural trends. These quilts can be read as extensions of the hands, bodies, minds, and spirits that constructed them, each artwork constituting a unique site of meaning that embodies the artist's identity, memories, and intentions. Like a roadmap, quilts direct us to their place of origin. Quilts provide comfort and a sense of safety. They make the unknown known, or the unknown home. The first piece we'll be diving into today is undoubtedly fitting to this exhibition, and that is Map Quilt. We decided to highlight where each quilt was made in the exhibition to further show how quilting is a global tradition, but specifically is tied to the history of America. This quilt was made by an unknown maker in probably Virginia around 1886. In the late 19th century, complicated pieced quilt patterns were made available in periodicals and pattern manufacturers' catalogs. The source of this map quilt traces back to ladies' magazines published in the 1880s. Although this map is an unusual treatment in the show quilt idiom, there is long precedence for depictions of maps on fabric in the early 19th century. Young women stitched sampler maps and three-dimensional fabric globes as part of their geography lessons. This map quilt, embroidered with the date 1886, represents the states of the Union and the U.S. territories as they were demarcated at that time. It is speculated that this quilt remains unfinished, as the embroidery is relatively subdued when viewed in the context of the period's excessive ornamentation. This quilt also sparks a conversation about borders, notably in the case of westward expansion in America. In 1845, John O'Sullivan, editor of the United States Magazine and Democratic Review, coined the term Manifest Destiny to describe the American westward expansion. This quickly became part of an ideology, a belief in the inherent superiority of white European Americans, which justified the right to conquer the territories of North America from sea to shining sea, and remove indigenous populations from the land. Forced displacement and violent extermination were two tactics employed to colonize and carve up the West. The conquest of new territories aggravated divisions over slavery and ultimately played a significant role in initiating the Civil War. The vivid colors and rich textures of this quilt demonstrate this exciting idea of luxury and opportunity in the eyes of the common American, yet the dark untold truth of white European American destiny often was hidden or ignored. Another exquisite quilt example is Soldier's Quilt, made by an unknown maker in probably India circa 1850 to 1875. This quilt belongs to a group of bed covers known as military quilts or Crimean quilts. Most of the examples known were found in Great Britain, where they were traditionally made from wool fabric used in the production of military uniforms. During the second half of the 19th century, soldiers were encouraged to take up sewing as an alternative to less salubrious pursuits like drinking and gambling. Sewing was also used as a form of therapy for soldiers who were injured in conflict and convalesced in hospitals. Note the exactness of each piece of cut felt wool and the detailed, varying stitch techniques, which in many cases is purely for aesthetic appeal. It seems that the makers of this quilt took significant pride and enjoyment in their work. This next example, created by Mrs. Eldad Miller and other unidentified artists in America around 1861, is a classic nod to quilt making and visually is probably very similar to the quilts many viewers grew up with. The Cross River Album quilt, similarly to the Soldier's Quilt, is a wonderful example of the importance of community in quilt making. However, in this example, rather than building bonds between soldiers, it is women who are forming the connections. Album quilts of the mid-19th century grew out of a fondness for autograph albums. By the 1840s, women were signing block quilts and sewing them together for a variety of reasons: to raise money for a charitable cause, to celebrate a particular event, to honor a distinguished member of the community, or as a gift for a departing family member or friend. In the time of a culture of domesticity, where women were often isolated in the home, group religious activities, primarily the quilting bee, allowed women to socialize, gossip, and share struggles with one another. This quilt literally shows the stitches between the community's women. There may have been a patriotic motivation behind the creation of this quilt as well. It is dated November 1st, 1861, the year that marked the start of the Civil War. Shortly before this quilt was dated, in June of that same year, Peterson's magazine printed a colored illustration for a red, white, and blue quilt in a very similar design under the caption, "A Patriotic Quilt." The magazine wanted to inspire readers to quilt their Union sympathies. At the bottom center of the Cross River Album quilt is a block and a flag design, enhanced with the embroidered word, Union. Quilting was one way women could participate in the political sphere, as they would not earn the right to vote for another 60 years. Jumping forward over a century, the next quilt on our tour is Star Quilt by Nora McEwen Ezell, created in Alabama in 1977. It's often unusual to know the maker of a quilt, as they are often not considered fine art objects. This quilt, being newer and made by a relatively well-known quilter, is a welcomed exception. Nora Ezell was a virtuosic artist known for her dazzling improvisational quilts. She was introduced to quilting by her mother and aunt, but was adamant about the fact that she was self-taught. She took pride in the originality of the designs she adapted from traditional patterns. In this work, Ezell has transformed a traditional 8-pointed Star of Hope pattern into what she sometimes referred to as a star puzzle quilt. The bold design and harmoniously discordant color patterns seen here are a product of her distinctive aesthetic and social and cultural context. Ezell fostered the capacity to improvise patterns and repurpose materials due to the distressed economic conditions of the post-industrial rural South. Rarely buying fabric, the artist used scraps to make most of her work, as was often done out of necessity in the history of quilt making. The artist fondly recalled the thrift of her childhood, when women made quilts and clothes from printed feed and fertilizer bags, while also unraveling the bags for the thread. To the artist, incorporating unconventional materials is also part of quilt making's artistry. Further influencing Ezell's creative output was her experience of the legacies of slavery, Reconstruction, and post-Reconstruction in the Jim Crow South. The star motif evokes celestial navigation used by enslaved people on the Underground Railroad. Some quilt historians also believe that quilt patterns were used as a kind of code to guide slaves to safety on their journey to freedom. According to Ezell, the Star of Hope pattern says, "Look to God for all things. Take your burden to Him and leave it there. He can and will fix it for you." The final quilt we will be discussing is my personal favorite in the exhibition, and is perhaps the most unconventional of the lot. Contrary to hearsay, he wasn't the devil, was created by Jean-Marcel Saint-Jacques in 2014. Saint-Jacques is a self-taught artist and identifies as a 12th generation Louisiana Afro-Creole. His family fled Louisiana in 1970 to escape racial oppression. 16 years ago, he returned to the state to reconnect with the land of his ancestors. Much of his art, like this example, is made with wood salvaged from his Katrina-damaged home in the Trem neighborhood. These wood quilts pay homage to the artist's great-grandparents. His great-grandfather was a hoodoo junk collector, and his great-grandmother was a quilt maker. Even the colors painted in house paint are a tribute to his great-grandmother's strip quilts. In this piece, like many others by Saint-Jacques, one can find a small portrait of the artist in a small blue square in the top left quadrant of the piece. To me, this artwork is a very interesting take on what makes a quilt. Like its fabric relatives, this piece is composed of bits and pieces of scraps that come from all different places and have a unique history. Rather than being categorized as a collage, which is also an artwork comprised of many things, the artist has chosen to call this piece a quilt, which to me adds a layer of personalization, comfort, and tradition to the work. Old door handles, window hinges, and pieces of wood are given new life by being painted in bright colors and joined together in harmony, signifying a story of rebuilding or rebirth. Thank you for joining me for this virtual Curators tour. I hoped you learned more about the history of quilting and the personal and geographic stories quilts can tell. To see many more fascinating quilts, each with their own unique tales, I encourage you to see Handstitched Worlds, the Cartography of Quilts, in person before it closes on September 11th, 2022.